I think it's 5:07 on Nashville's Morning News. I've gone ahead and just time checked us both. There's nobody else in the building but us, and so we're just kind of having a little bit of fun. By the way,
I'm going to go get some of that coffee. I'll be back.
The super text line is open, the 615-737-9986. Also, you can find us on video, and Super Talk TV is also broadcasting Facebook and YouTube and Twitch and Twitter as well. There is a lot of news going on today, so it is a good thing that we are live today because we do have the president landing in Kyiv in Ukraine. Very surprising move by the president. By the way, we also have big news because over the weekend, we find out now that China is saying that they are going to perhaps provide lethal support to Russia in their war against Ukraine. And so this is, of course, a major escalation in a war where it seems like pretty much every other day there is a major escalation. Antony Blinken, of course, Secretary of State, he was on Face the Nation, and he says, yes, indeed, things are changing rapidly.
We've been concerned from day one about that possibility. In fact, if you go back to the very first conversations that President Biden and President Xi had about Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, just a couple of weeks into the war, President Biden shared with President Xi our deep concern about the possibility China would provide lethal support to Russia in this effort, as well as engage in the systematic evasion of sanctions. And the reason for that concern was just weeks before the aggression. You'll remember that President Xi and President Putin had a meeting in which they just talked about a partnership with no limits.
Yep, that is, again, Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And this week you've got, and over the weekend, you had a big old congressional delegation in Germany at the Munich Security Conference, where you've got, of course, Ukraine and American politicians talking about the next step in the war. So there is a lot going on because you do have the president in Poland at some point today, I believe either right now or earlier in the evening or morning, whatever you want to say, the president landed in Kyiv. So there is a lot going on with China and their threat to provide lethal support to Russia. Of course, the balloon issue is at play. Remember that China continues to say that this situation with the spy balloon is really no big deal. They've been warning the United States to stop with the rhetoric, stop with the quote-unquote overreaction. And part of this, I believe, part of this support for Russia from China could be in response to the president deciding to shoot down those 3 non-threatening objects last weekend. Because remember who looks really foolish here? The president, and frankly America, looks foolish here for shooting down these 3 non-threatening objects last weekend or weekend before last, whatever you want to say, about 7, 8, 9 days ago. And so for China and for the rest of the world, at least to me, it's the same old Biden. Let China's spy balloon fly across the country, yet shoot down weather balloons and a hobby balloon as well. Not exactly talking tough, not exactly putting our best military foot forward. And so now you do have China saying, okay, so you have the American president just completely butchering or botching the response to the spy balloon. So now you have an emboldened President Xi Jinping in China saying, you know what? We may actually support Russia with some lethal weaponry. Here's more from Antony Blinken.
To date, we have seen Chinese companies, and of course in China there's really no distinction between private companies and the state. We have seen them provide non-lethal support to Russia for use in Ukraine. The concern that we have now is based on information we have that they're considering providing lethal support. And we've made very clear to them that would cause a serious problem for us and in our relationship.
So again, that is Antony Blinken. The question is, what exactly is lethal support? Guns, ammo, tanks, I'm assuming that kind of thing. Now, so far, Russia has received non-lethal support. So that means drone technology, vehicles, perhaps, obviously intelligence from China. Now, don't forget that both China and Iran don't abide by any kind of sanctions leveled on Russia either. So that keeps Russia in business and in some semblance of money for their economy and for their military. Now, China hasn't come out. This is part of what I find interesting. China hasn't come out and openly supported Russia. They've been really trying to remain neutral, maybe broker some peace deals, whatever it is. At least that is what China is saying. But what they're doing is completely different. So to me, on the surface, China trying to, remain neutral, or at least be perceived as remaining neutral here, but at the same time supporting Russia in a couple of different ways. Now, if China openly now decides, okay, we're going to give Russia all kinds of lethal weaponry, well, then that is a massive escalation on China's part. And of course, Russia would welcome that, clearly, obviously, because Russia's in a situation right now where Vladimir Putin, I believe, is going to start, if he's not already, getting desperate. Now, apparently, this week, President Xi Jinping from China is going to call for peace on Friday in a big old speech. And apparently what he is actually trying to do is broker a peace deal. So there's all kinds of things going on with this. Now, realize the U.S. and NATO providing weapons to Ukraine. We've been doing this for a year now. Billions of dollars in weaponry and systems. We have not sent fighter planes, and so far we won't be, or other nations will not be sending Ukraine fighter planes either, which is exactly, though, what they want. But Lindsey Graham is out there saying that we, as in America and our NATO allies and the European Union, we need to step up our support for Ukraine beyond the billions of dollars that we're already giving Ukraine in weaponry and money. By the way, Iran is also involved in all of this. And so there's a lot going on. So one of the things, as we talk about China, we talk about Russia, we talk about Iran as well. Iran is out there as well, giving Russia all kinds of not only intelligence, but also weaponry as well. None of this comes as any kind of surprise. All of this coming out, by the way, again, while Biden headed to Poland today, landing in Kyiv, there's all this talk about Poland supplying jets to Ukraine. Now, this was a story about, I want to say 4 or 5, maybe 6 months ago. That is still on the table, and there's a lot of people predicting now that between Poland, America, NATO, European Union, one way or another, you're going to have Ukraine get these fighter jets. This is Antony Blinken talking about Iran and their involvement in all of this.
Iran is also accused of providing more weaponry to Russia here. Mm-hmm. So they are building an alliance.
We've seen Iran provide drones that Russia is using in Ukraine to attack civilian infrastructure, to kill civilians. This is something that's been going on for months. We've been working to expose that, to take action against it, to sanction it. There's an increasingly noxious relationship between Russia and Iran, and it's actually a two-way street. Not only is Iran providing this equipment to Russia, but Russia is also providing military equipment to Iran, including, it looks like, sophisticated fighter planes. That's something that looks like it may be happening, which would make Iran an even greater threat. That relationship is a growing concern.
Yeah, also of growing concern, you just had China's president, Xi Jinping, host Iran's president last week. So their relations are said to be warming. And I know that you're looking at all the chess pieces, just like I am. So here's where this whole thing is ultimately said to be landing. You've got Russia against Ukraine. You've got China and Iran, possibly at some point North Korea, also siding with Russia. So then, of course, you have America, NATO, European Union as well. All of these nations siding clearly, obviously, with Ukraine. So the question is, are we on the precipice of World War III? I don't know, but it certainly does seem to be lining up that way. By the way, China also wants to resolve the issue of Iran's nuclear program. Remember the whole Iranian nuclear deal? That thing is still percolating as well. Now, remember what all of these nations have in common, whether we're talking about China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. What do they all have in common? They all have in common a hatred for America. That is their unifying factor. And so when you have this combined hatred for America, that does bring all of these nations together. One of the other things that we've been talking about the last couple of weeks is the fact that China, in the midst of this whole weather balloon situation, they refuse to pick up the hotline between America and China. That is one of the most worrisome things out there. As people look at this, they look at our relationship with China and about how it is spiraling out of control, and they refuse to answer the phone call when these phone lines were put in to de-escalate these kinds of situations. This is part of what Antony Blinken said about that.
Finally, it was important for me to underscore that we believe having lines of communication, engaging in direct diplomacy, is very important. We have a responsibility to manage our relationship in a responsible manner. That's part of what this evening was about.
Does that mean their defense minister will pick up the next phone call from Secretary Austin instead of refusing it?
Well, it's one of the things that we talked about, the importance of having lines of communication, including military-to-military lines of communication. It's vital to making sure that there aren't miscommunications, misunderstandings, especially if you've got a crisis or some other situation on your hands.
So you'll notice when he was directly asked the question, so does that mean that China will pick up the phone when we have a situation? He didn't answer the question. So that tells me that in his meeting with his Chinese counterparts, it sounds like, even though he's trying to make it seem like they came to somewhat of an understanding, I don't think that they have. I think that our relations with China are simply getting worse and worse and worse. And it couldn't come at a worse time, because the war between Russia and Ukraine doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. As a matter of fact, last week, we told you about how you've got some politicians out there that are saying
the nuclear weapons saber. Russia's deputy foreign minister this week spoke of catastrophic consequences if the West continues to arm Ukraine with the objective of seeing Russia defeated. Should the world consider Putin and his regime's repeated reference to the use of nuclear weapons as a real threat? That's one of the questions that we need to ask. Professor Sean Maloney joins us, professor of history at the Royal Military College. He served as the historical advisor to the Chief of Land Staff during the war in Afghanistan. The professor is also the first Canadian civilian military historian to go into combat since the Second World War. He's an expert on the issue of nuclear weapons and the author of many books, including Emergency War Plan, The American Doomsday Machine. Professor Maloney, thanks very much for joining us. How are you?
Hey, it's good to be back.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you were with us a couple of months ago, last year. So you have on-the-ground experience in Afghanistan during this U.S.-led military invention, which involved Canada, of course. And you have a likely better than almost anyone understanding of al-Qaeda. You've been an advisor to Canadian military commanders. And so based on your firsthand knowledge of warfare and your perspective as a war historian, can I start with this? How would you describe what's happening, before we get to the nuclear weapons issue, how would you describe what's happening in Ukraine?
Right now, the regime is trying to generate what we call the frozen conflict. They want to try and freeze everything in place, develop peace talks, have discussions so they can hold on to what they've got, so they can rebuild, rearm, and then at some point in the future come back at Ukraine. They've done this before already, obviously, from 2014 to 2021, 22. So their objective is to not lose and to hold on to whatever they've got. At the same time, they keep trying to generate, there's a lot of terms for it, hybrid warfare, gray zone warfare, Gabrene Motodi, there's a whole bunch of names for it. The idea they can disrupt countries using cyber, using political warfare, media, information ops. Okay, so that's all designed to keep everybody on the back heel as much as possible. Okay. So that's where we're at right now.
Does the Russian invasion of Ukraine complicate other issues globally, potentially, like India and Pakistan, for example?
I would look at the whole conflict in Ukraine and the confrontation between Russia and the West as having large implications, not only on the military side, but economically, socially, etc. It's like dropping a stone into a pond, right? The issue here is if people hadn't stood up to this, then others would be emboldened to do similar things elsewhere. There's no doubt about that.
So your book, American War Plan, The American Doomsday Machine, I want to ask you this question. When Putin rattles the nuclear sabers, what happens within the United States military's nuclear weapons group? What goes on in the United States when Putin or his foreign minister start talking about catastrophic consequences? And don't forget, we have nukes.
You can't separate what they're saying from what they're doing. So if they're saying something and they're not backing it up with maneuvers of nuclear forces, then generally it's talk, or it's designed to support some other initiative they've got going. If they're making those threats and they're actually maneuvering nuclear forces, then that's when it becomes a bit of a problem. So, but yeah, the U.S. and the French and the British, remember, they have nuclear weapons too. Keep a very close eye on what the other side's doing at all times. And I've been watching them myself since going back to 2021, this crisis, and before that. So when they maneuver things, sometimes it's designed to backstop something else they're doing, i.e. they're indicating they're serious. It could be used to underscore some diplomatic move they're making. But what's really interesting is they keep making these threats in various forms over a year. And it's like crying wolf. It's really interesting to watch this. This is unprecedented even from the Cold War. The duration of this, the types of threats, the way they convey the threats. They'll have Dmitry Kiselev and other people in the media talk about it. They'll have Dmitry Medvedev talk about it. So what are they trying to do? Well, what they're basically trying to do is they're trying to stir up people in the West to be afraid of what's going on. So this is essentially what we would call information warfare. So whenever you see in the mainstream media a blip of people getting upset about getting nuked, and you've seen that probably 3 or 4 times over the past year, right? Yes. That'll be augmented with social media. They'll put up footage of their nuclear system being manipulated. They'll let us know what they're doing. But it is designed to generate fear, dismay, and defeatism within our civilian populations. Okay? It's a very multimedia approach. It's an influence activity. It's designed for them to get what they want. It's not separate from the other things they're doing.
Can you envision a scenario which would see the Russians use so-called battlefield nuclear weapons in this war with Ukraine?
Well, we actually did earlier last year a couple of times. We took a look at, me and some friends of mine, took a look at what they could gain from doing so, what they lose from doing so. We looked at chem as well. And in this case, there's a couple of situations they've been in. It's been utterly catastrophic. Well, the Kharkiv offensive is one, and there are others, including direct attacks against their air bases inside Russia itself. So if they haven't used anything along those lines, they're probably being deterred from doing so, either internally or by external forces or both. So in this case, they've maneuvered things around to try to indicate they're serious, and then they don't do it. So obviously something's happening on our side whereby they're being deterred. And I can see that stuff being maneuvered around, especially with the Brits and the French will let people know they're doing things. The Americans, you can see stuff moving around. So that's what's happening in the background to everything that's going on. But what they want fear to be generated within our civilian populations to put pressure on the governments to back off supporting Ukraine. That's what this is all about.
So, well, a lot of people have asked this question. I can't answer it, but I know you can. What exactly is a battlefield nuke? What does it do? How potent is it? How much damage does it do?
Okay, this gets really technical, but in the old days of the Cold War, there was no distinction between nuclear weapons types in the 1950s. Okay, and some people tried to delineate it by yield. And yield, we're talking multi-megaton weapons that can erase a city, versus smaller weapons in the kiloton yield that can have a more limited local effect. Some people started calling those tactical and strategic weapons, but that never made sense, because if you could use a smaller yield weapon to generate a strategic effect, then what do you call it? So the term battlefield weapons tends to be weapons that can have an impact on fighting on the ground itself, as opposed to being flung back and forth over the pole and delivered by bombers, that sort of thing. I would suggest anything under 10 kilotons would be a battlefield nuclear weapon, but you can have even ones that are even a fraction of a kiloton. So, and what we're talking about here specifically in Ukraine, the things that I was watching them move around, or think I saw them moving around, they have artillery shells that can yield between 1 and 10 kiloton. And then, in theory, you can use those in particular ways in the battlefield to make up for the lack of another capability. But the problem is, you cross that line, then you've crossed a line you can't back away from, and they know that. So if you use 1, you might as well use 10. If you use 10, you might as well use 100. And then if you use 100, then all of a sudden you're dealing with the strategic stuff happening. So they've obviously done the calculation and realized that the benefit is not there, given what the cost is, and that's the fundamentals of deterrence.
It's quite amazing. The calculations that go into it, and the disinformation and the manipulation of civilian populations.
I watch it all the time, and I mean, I get people getting hold of me all the time, like, Dr. Maloney, are we going to get nuked and die? I'm like, maybe, but maybe not. They want something definite. I can't do that.
Yeah.
But, or are we going to die? Like, yeah, you're going to die, just not from nuclear warfare.
No, that's encouraging.
The thing is, for us, the Canadian problem is a bit different because they're not going to blow away our cities. They're going to go after anything that can support nuclear operations. Any 10,000-foot runway, probably. They would probably use EMP, electromagnetic pulse, to screw up all of our computing systems and electronics. I mean, that puts us back into the 19th century anyway. I mean, do you want to be in the 19th century or do you want to be in the 16th century? Which is better, right?
I have no idea. I have to think about that one. But I hear what you're saying. If they do cut loose with an EMP, then our technology is done.
Well, look, North Korea can do that. It doesn't have to.
Yeah, I guess.
Sure, China. I mean, North Korea has the capability of doing that. So that's one of the reasons everybody's really concerned about little North Korea having even a small number of weapons. And we all know it. Those of us that study this stuff. There's a lot of people. I remember writing somebody high up and said, we figured out how we're going to mitigate the effects of this. And I got this letter back from on high, written by a staffer half my age, saying, "Yeah, we're going to spend an additional $5 on NORAD." I really got concerned that people weren't considering this, but then our whole society hasn't considered this stuff really since the Cold War.
Professor Maloney, is it more challenging today? Is the world more challenging from the perspective of the presence of and potential use of nuclear weapons today than it was during the Cold War? And I remember in 1962 being a rookie in high school and being warned about the Cuban Missile Crisis and being told what we should do in case the nukes started to fly. Which time was more challenging?
Oh, I'd say our current time's more challenging. There's more ambiguity. There's more fear. There's more knowledge amongst the population and by our adversaries of how societies operate. I'd say our period is extremely complex. I'm not saying the Cold War itself was simple. It was a system unto itself that was dangerous at particular points in time. There's no doubt about that. Cuba was one of them, but it was only one of several. And most, unless somebody's really studied this in depth, there are other crises where nuclear weapons use was possible that generally aren't studied too much by the general public. But Cuba's the go-to because it's really dramatic, it's really public, and it's really dangerous. So, but I'd say we've got our own problems now where things are complex in our own way. And it requires our populations to know more about how the world works than I think that they do. And we're back to education, right? I mean, how much of this is taught in school? Nobody really explains how the world system operates right now because we're still working through it. But the Cold War does have a lot of lessons for us, particularly with deterrence, because deterrence works. We've watched it work continuously, at least for a 42-year period. And there's a lot of debate about this. I've got colleagues that disagree with me on this, but it's one of the reasons I wrote Emergency War Plan, was to take a look at it again. And another book I did called Deconstructing Dr. Strangelove, which partly deals with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there are ways that which deterrence works, but they're usually not seen by the public. It's usually in the Arctic, or it's like Hunter October under the ocean, or it's in deep bunkers somewhere. So, but there are things that do go on that the public generally doesn't see. In Canada particularly, we've moved our air defense forces numerous times up into the Arctic to keep an eye on what the Russians are doing up there with bombers. The problem is that you've got commentators that just say, oh, it's just an exercise, or it doesn't matter, or they do this all the time, or whatever. And it's more serious than that. We have to keep an eye on them. Here's one for you. I mean, people generally don't know this, but in March 2021, Russia put 3 ballistic missile submarines through the Arctic ice. And I calculated they carried about 400 nuclear weapons.
Whoa.
They did it, and they filmed it so we can see it. They made sure that everybody could see that. And that never showed up in Canadian media at all. And that's probably because the Canadian government chose not to get nuclear submarines, so somebody else has to do that up in the Arctic. That's the Americans and the British. So the Americans and British do defense for us up in the north, and that's not palatable to people one way or another. So that's why we're part of coalitions, right?
Yeah. So when the Russians, or Putin, pulled Russia temporarily anyway out of the START treaty,
yep.
How significant was that? Was that just for show, or is there substance to that?
That's actually very significant. So basically what START does, it gives a limit in the number of weapons that can be deployed. And there's a mechanism to count them and verify that. Okay. What this means, and we got to go back to the basis of deterrence, and basis of deterrence is what we call target coverage. You have to have enough weapons to hit the things that you want to hit and let the other side see that so the deterrence works. So in this case, it's pretty clear that they don't have enough weapons to do target coverage the way they want to do it, and they want to expand the number of weapons they've got. Now, that's really interesting because the only country that's expanding its nuclear arsenal right now is People's Republic of China. So there's a little, maybe that relationship is not as tight as people think that it is. But target coverage that you have. Now, here's the other important thing. When we're dealing with Russian technology, it's not necessarily as reliable. So from the research I did, they would double and sometimes triple the number of weapons going onto a target just to make sure they kill it, right? Because there's a calculation that the missile has to leave its silo and operate. It has to get up into space and dispense its nukes up there. The weapons have to come through the atmosphere there, and then they have to detonate over the target. You do a calculation, the probability of kill like that, and if the technology is suspect, they're going to double and triple the number of weapons that they're going to be firing at something. So they want more weapons. Get it?
Yeah, I do. We have less than a minute here. I wish we had more, but should we start to worry now? Is there cause to be concerned, or do we need just more information?
Well, I think the deterrent system's working, and people need to really understand that. There's a lot of people that don't want to understand that. They'd rather be afraid rather than taking the time to figure this stuff out, which is their choice. But in this case, that system's not going away anytime soon. And we're part of it with NORAD. That is integrated into all of this. Canada is not neutral.
More global leaders should call for peace talks in Ukraine, which has been fending off a Russian invasion for the second year now. There seems to be no end in sight to the war that weighs down other nations recovering from another crisis, the COVID pandemic. Recently, China proposed a 12-point plan for ending the war. Russia, to its credit, claimed to be receptive, but the United States was skeptical, partly because China's plan lacks specifics and does not mention Russian troops' withdrawal from Ukraine. In a related issue, tensions are high between the U.S. and China, which Americans fear may supply weapons and ammunition to Russia. Chinese officials have denied that, but they have yet to condemn Russia's aggression. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky seems willing to give China the benefit of the doubt, and according to reports, he is willing to meet with President Xi Jinping to discuss the proposed peace plan. The Philippines should convince the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, to encourage all peace initiatives between Ukraine and Russia. Even if China's plan is imperfect and only has a slight chance of jump-starting the peace process, the initiative will still be worthwhile. Expecting an ideal plan at the outset seems unreasonable anyway. Besides, many issues are impossible to resolve for now. For instance, Ukraine has a right to defend and reclaim its lost territory, but Russia will not likely give up the areas that it now controls, including Crimea. Of course, many people doubt Russia's sincerity in any peace initiative. Even then, the world should rally behind China's peacemaking efforts, especially if it can bring some relief to the fighting. Even if that does not happen, it would be better to have China play peacemaker rather than see it openly side with Russia. Leaders should take advantage of the fact that Russia did not reject China's plan, even though parts of it seem unfavorable to Moscow. Note that among the 12 points are calls to end the humanitarian crisis, which sounds like a dig against attacks on civilian targets in Ukraine. Also, China urges the protection of nuclear power plants and discourages the use of nuclear weapons. Again, that seems meant for Russia, which has threatened to use nuclear weapons if it loses the conventional war in Ukraine. Instead of asking for ideal conditions before holding talks, world leaders should take small steps. First, bring Ukraine and Russia back to the negotiating table. Second, initiate a ceasefire during the talks. Who knows what could happen next? Even an uneasy peace will be better than continuing the war, and along with it, the suffering of people. High toll. No country has been spared from the war in Ukraine. According to the World Bank, the global economy continues to be weakened by the war through significant disruptions in trade and food and fuel price shocks, all of which are contributing to high inflation and subsequent tightening in global financing conditions. The 2023 outlook remains bleak. A recession looms over Europe, perhaps even in the US. Inflation remains high worldwide, and all of these can be traced back to Ukraine. Many nations, including the Philippines, are impacted. Obviously, Ukraine is suffering more, and its losses cannot be captured by mere economic figures. The United Nations Human Rights Office reported that at least 8,000 Ukrainian civilians have died during the war, and nearly 13,300 others have been injured. Also, some 14 million people have been displaced. Like China and others in ASEAN, the Philippines has been calling for peace in Ukraine. Last year, Foreign Affairs Secretary Enrique Manalo said, "The ongoing Ukraine-Russia crisis is an example of how one conflict can affect the entire world given the interdependent nature of modern national economies." He added, "We urge all those concerned to exert every effort and continue utilizing diplomatic and peaceful means to end this conflict and therefore alleviate the suffering not only of the people in Ukraine and in the region, but also globally." Hopefully, more leaders will listen to that appeal, and initiatives like China's peace plan will prosper. And that's the editorial for Monday, March 6, 2023. For more news and information, get a copy of the Manila Times on print, subscribe to its digital edition, or log on to www.manilatimes.net. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, and listen to the voice of the Times.